The morning started like any other Saturday in the Riverside neighborhood, quiet, predictable, the kind of day that should have involved nothing more dramatic than breakfast and yard work. Marcus Chen stood at his kitchen window with a cold cup of coffee, watching the clouds drift lazily overhead. The sky was an almost offensive shade of perfect blue, the kind that made people want to do stupid things outdoors. He'd learned this the hard way over his 43 years of living in suburbia. His house was a modest Victorian-style home, the kind with a wraparound porch and too much yard space. He'd inherited the mortgage from his divorce 3 years ago, a settlement that meant he got the house, the debt, and the solitude. He'd made peace with two of those things. The solitude, especially, had become something he genuinely valued. The backyard was his sanctuary. He'd spent the last 2 years turning it into something Instagram-worthy, though he'd never actually posted anything on Instagram. There was a newly installed saltwater pool, still gleaming like a jewel in the morning light. Around it, he'd landscaped with careful attention to detail, native plants, a sitting area with natural stone, and a pergola draped in climbing jasmine that smelled like his mother's perfume. It had cost him nearly $40,000 of his savings, but it was worth every penny, or at least it had been. It appeared around 9:47 a.m., backing slowly up his driveway with the precision of an experienced driver. Marcus watched from his window, coffee forgotten, as two men began unloading folding tables, white linens, and what looked like industrial-sized coolers. His hand went instinctively to his chest, where his heart had begun an irregular staccato rhythm. "What the?" he muttered, setting down his mug and heading toward the back door. The second thing he noticed was Karen. She materialized from behind the truck like some kind of terrifying suburban demon, holding a clipboard and wearing oversized sunglasses that made her head look like a fly's. She was tall, probably mid-50s, with blonde hair that had been lightened so many times it looked almost white. She wore white linen pants that cost more than Marcus's monthly car payment and a designer top that announced her status with every thread. Marcus recognized her immediately. Karen Whitmore. She lived 2 streets over, in the McMansion that had replaced the modest craftsman cottage that used to sit there. She was the kind of person who complained about neighborhood noise levels at 7 p.m., who called the HOA about everyone else's landscaping choices, who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from making other people's lives slightly worse. What she was doing in his backyard, Marcus had no idea. "Excuse me," he called out, stepping onto the patio. His voice came out smaller than he intended, as if part of him already knew he was outmatched. "Can I help you with something?" Karen turned, and Marcus saw her do that particular thing that rich, powerful people do when they encounter someone they've decided is beneath their station. A subtle dismissal, a slight widening of the eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe someone so irrelevant was speaking to her directly. "Oh, hello," she said, her voice carrying the specific tone of someone addressing an employee. "I was hopping to catch someone. My daughter's friends are coming over for a pool party this afternoon. I called about renting your yard, but apparently the person I spoke to didn't get back to me with confirmation." Marcus stared at her. He replayed her words in his mind, waiting for them to make sense. They didn't. "I'm sorry," he said carefully, choosing his words like he was defusing a bomb. "You called about renting my yard." "Yes," Karen said, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "For the party. Your house is the only one on this street with a pool, and honestly, it's the perfect size. I was willing to pay $500 for the afternoon. That's quite generous if you think about it." The amount was insulting. It was also irrelevant. What was relevant was that she was currently setting up her party in his yard without his permission, as if ownership were merely a suggestion, as if she had the natural right to use whatever she wanted whenever she wanted. Marcus felt something crystallize inside his chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder than that, a recognition. This was the moment. This was the moment where he could either say no and be the bad guy in everyone else's story, or he could let it happen and disappear into his own life, letting other people write his narrative. "I didn't agree to this," he said quietly. Karen lowered her sunglasses and looked at him over the top of them. "Your assistant said it would be fine." "I don't have an assistant." "Well, whoever answered your phone." She waved her hand dismissively. "In any case, the caterers are already here and the girls will be arriving at noon. I'm sure we can work out the details later. For now, perhaps you could just stay inside. We'll try not to be too loud." It was the stay inside that did it. The casual assumption of control, the way she was removing him from his own home like he was an inconvenience, an obstacle to be worked around. Marcus looked at the caterers, who were now erecting a canopy. He looked at the tables being set up near his pool, his carefully landscaped pool. He looked at Corinne Whitmore, who was already turning away from him, already dismissing him, already confident that her will would prevail. And he said no. The word came out soft, but it had weight. Corinne turned back slowly, as if she couldn't quite believe she'd been contradicted. "I'm sorry," she said. "No," Marcus repeated, louder this time. "You can't have my yard. You didn't ask me. You didn't get my permission. You showed up with caterers and construction equipment and told me to hide in my house. The answer is no. Take everything down and get out." For a moment, Corinne was silent. Marcus could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the quick inventory of her options. In the end, she smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You know," she said, "I had a feeling you'd be difficult about this. I've already made commitments. 17 teenage girls are going to be here in 2 hours. The caterers are paid for. I've hired a DJ." She gestured around at the yard. "Your cooperation would have been nice, but it's not actually necessary. I own a piece of this street, and I have every right to use the common areas." "This isn't a common area," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "This is my private property." "We'll see about that," Corinne said, and she turned back to the caterers, as if the conversation was over, as if his objections had been noted and filed and ultimately forgotten. Marcus stood on his patio, watching her bark orders at the workers. She had them move his own chairs. She had them reposition his tables. She pointed at the pergola and told them to drape more fabric to create better wind protection for the DJ equipment. She was transforming his sanctuary into her venue, and she was doing it with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been told no. He stood there for another 5 minutes, hoping that she would sense the weight of his stare, hoping that she would recognize some internal warning signal and back down. She didn't. She became, if anything, more animated, more commanding, more certain of her right to be there. By 11 o'clock, the transformation was nearly complete. Tables were laden with expensive catering supplies, sushi platters, seafood towers, champagne bottles sweating in ice buckets. A DJ's equipment had been set up at the far end of the yard, near the pergola. String lights were being strung by workers who looked uncomfortable but professional. Corinne circulated through the setup like a general inspecting troops, tweaking, adjusting, commanding. Marcus retreated inside his house. He closed the sliding glass doors. He closed the curtains. He tried to watch television, but he couldn't focus on anything. His eye kept twitching. His stomach felt like it was eating itself. By noon, the first guests had arrived. Through a crack in the curtains, Marcus watched them pour into his yard. 17 teenage girls in designer swimwear, carrying designer bags, moving like they owned the world because girls like that always moved like that. Their laughter was sharp and piercing. Their phones were constantly out, documenting, filming, broadcasting. They treated his pool like it was a prop, a detail in their expensive teenage lives. And Corinne stood at the center of it all, beaming with the satisfaction of someone who had bent the world to her will. Marcus sat on his couch, watching his own backyard become a staging ground for someone else's vision. He could hear every word of Corinne's commentary. "Isn't this view gorgeous? My neighbor was very generous to let us use his yard." A lie. A beautiful, casual lie, spoken to impress the other parents who had shown up to drop off their daughters. That was when something shifted. It wasn't a conscious decision, not at first. It was more like a seismic event happening in his chest, something fundamental reorganizing itself. Marcus had spent his entire adult life being accommodating, being reasonable, being the kind of person who didn't make a fuss. His ex-wife had called it his superpower. His therapist had called it a trauma response. Either way, he'd become very good at disappearing into the background, at allowing other people's narratives to override his own. But this was his house. This was his pool. This was his sanctuary, his $40,000 sanctuary, and Corinne Whitmore had walked into it like it belonged to her and had told him to stay inside. Marcus stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing like ice. He walked to the garage, moving like someone in a trance. He opened the supply closet and found what he was looking for, the original sprinkler system timer and control panel, installed before he'd put in the saltwater pool. It was a commercial-grade system, designed to water the entire yard with precision. He'd kept it just in case. He'd kept it exactly for a moment like this, though he hadn't known it at the time. Marcus checked his watch. 1:47 p.m. The party was in full swing. He could hear the DJ's music pumping through his house, could feel the bass vibrating through his bones. He set the timer for 2:30 p.m., 43 minutes. Enough time for everyone to be fully committed to their fun, fully invested in the moment, fully unprepared for what was about to happen. He pressed the button to activate the system. The commercial-grade sprinkler system Marcus had inherited with the property was not a gentle thing. It had been designed in the 1970s, in an era before water conservation had become fashionable. Each sprinkler head launched a powerful arc of water 15 feet into the air with the force of a fire hose. The system had 8 main zones that covered the entire yard in overlapping patterns. When activated, it was an overwhelming torrent. Marcus hadn't tested it at full capacity since he'd moved in. He disabled most of the system when he installed the pool, redirecting the water lines. But the controls remained, and the main lines were still functional. All 8 zones, if activated simultaneously, would create something close to a monsoon. He held the timer in his hands, watching the minutes count down. 2:15 p.m. He could hear Corinne's voice, sharp and commanding. "Girls, get in the pool. There's a photographer coming at 3." Her voice carried the particular shrillness of someone performing authority, someone who needed others to see her giving orders. 2:25 p.m. Marcus stood at the garage door, watching the yard through the small window. He could see the caterers clearing plates, the teenagers in the pool screaming with laughter, Corinne standing at the edge, phone in hand, documenting her success. She was wearing her own swimsuit now, a designer piece that probably cost more than his first car. She looked triumphant. 2:29 p.m. Marcus's hand hovered over the timer. This was the moment. This was the moment where he could still turn back, could still be the reasonable man, the man who didn't make waves. He thought about the consequences. Corinne would be furious. She would probably sue him. She would definitely call the police and claim he'd attacked her intentionally. The neighborhood would take her side. People always took the side of the person with more money. But then he remembered the casual way she'd told him to stay inside. The certainty in her voice, the absolute conviction that the world was hers to reshape. He pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low mechanical grinding sound, the ancient system waking up from dormancy. And then, the eruption was glorious and terrible. All 8 sprinkler zones activated simultaneously. The system came to life with a roar, launching columns of water across the entire yard with the force of hydraulic cannons. The water arced 15, 20 feet into the air, creating a chaotic, overlapping pattern of streams that covered every square foot of space. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Corinne's scream cut through the spray, a sound of pure outrage and shock. The teenage girls shrieked, not all of them unpleasantly surprised. There was something fundamentally funny about being unexpectedly soaked, and their shrieks contained echoes of laughter. But Corinne's rage was pure and undiluted. "Turn it off," she was screaming, waving her arms like she could command nature itself. "Turn it off now." But Marcus didn't turn it off. The timer was set for 5 minutes. 5 minutes of uninterrupted, overwhelming water pressure. 5 minutes for Corinne Whitmore to experience what it felt like to have her will overridden, to have something taken from her, to understand, for perhaps the first time in her comfortable life, that the world did not automatically obey her commands. The DJ equipment, being electronics, had already begun smoking. The caterers were frantically covering food with whatever materials they could find, but it was pointless. The tables were becoming streams. The careful arrangements were dissolving into chaos. Corinne's designer outfit was plastered to her body. Her hair, carefully styled and maintained, hung in soaked ropes down her back. Her sunglasses had fallen into the pool. She looked, Marcus thought, like she'd been caught in a monsoon, which technically she had been. And he was recording all of it on his phone. The 5 minutes felt like 5 seconds and 5 hours simultaneously. When the timer finally ran out and the sprinklers shut off with a hydraulic sigh, the yard looked like a disaster zone. Water still dripped from every surface. The caterers stood in stunned silence. The teenagers were laughing, genuinely laughing, at the absurdity of it all. Corinne stood in the center of the chaos, dripping and shaking with fury. When she looked up and saw Marcus standing at the garage window, she saw in his face not apology or fear, but something else entirely: satisfaction. Cold, crystalline satisfaction. He watched as her face went purple with rage. He watched as she began pointing at him, her voice hoarse from screaming. He watched as she started giving orders to the caterers, to the DJ, to anyone who would listen. "Pack it all up. Now I'm calling the police, I'm suing, I'm—" Her voice cracked. She was crying now underneath the remaining spray of water, tears mixing with pond water and makeup. Marcus stood in the doorway of his garage, completely dry, completely calm, and completely committed to whatever came next. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as the patrol car pulled slowly down his street, its arrival seeming to draw the attention of every neighbor within a 3-block radius. By the time Officer Tom Reynolds stepped out of the vehicle, his hand instinctively moving to his utility belt, there was a small but growing audience of suburban observers, many of them still in their weekend casual wear, many of them carrying their phones. Officer Reynolds was a man Marcus recognized vaguely, someone he'd seen around the neighborhood, someone with the tired eyes of a person who had been handling suburban disputes for too long to find any of them interesting. He was probably in his late 50s, with gray at his temples and a paunch that suggested he spent more time processing paperwork than anything more physically demanding. Karen intercepted him before he could even get to the house. She was still soaking wet, her outfit clinging to her in a way that seemed to intensify her rage. Her voice carried across the entire street, cutting through the ambient noise of suburban Saturday afternoon. "Officer, thank God, I want to file a report. This man," she pointed directly at Marcus through his kitchen window, "assaulted me and my guests with an agricultural irrigation system. It was completely unprovoked, deliberate. I want him arrested." Officer Reynolds took off his sunglasses and rubbed his eyes in a way that suggested he'd heard a lot of angry explanations in his career, and that none of them had been accurate. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to slow down. Let me start by asking you, did the homeowner activate the sprinklers?" "Yes," Karen practically shrieked. "I just told you, he activated them intentionally. He was angry that I was using his yard for a small, private party." "Using his yard without his permission," Officer Reynolds interrupted gently. "Or am I misunderstanding the situation?" Marcus could see Karen's face go through a rapid series of calculations. She was trying to figure out how to reframe the narrative, how to present her story in a way that made her the victim. It was clearly difficult for her. "I had attempted to rent his yard," she said finally, choosing her words with visible effort. "The arrangements had been made with someone at his residence." "Was it the homeowner?" Reynolds asked. "No, but—" "Then it doesn't really count as an arrangement, does it?" Reynolds was not unkind, but he was clearly not interested in Karen's semantic games. "Did he tell you that you could use his pool?" Karen's jaw tightened. He was being unreasonable. The party was already set up. I was providing him $500, which is a more than fair. "Did he say you could use the pool?" Reynolds had the monotone of someone who'd asked this question 1,000 times before. "No," Karen said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But he could have just asked us to leave. He didn't have to assault us." "Activating a sprinkler system on your own property isn't assault," Reynolds said, and there was something almost sympathetic in his voice, as if he felt bad having to deliver this particular piece of information. "Especially when you're trespassing. Did he tell you to leave your property?" "Yes, but—" "And you refused." Karen's face had gone from purple with rage to pale with the realization that the police officer was not, in fact, going to be her ally in this situation. "Officer, I don't think you understand. This man is a hostile person who—" "I think I understand the situation pretty clearly," Reynolds said. He turned to look at Marcus's house, then called out, "Mr. Chen, you in there." Marcus opened the back door and stepped onto the patio. He moved carefully, aware that everything he did now was being observed and potentially documented. He kept his hands visible. He kept his expression neutral. He had the phone recording the sprinkler incident in his back pocket, but he wasn't going to mention it unless asked. "I'm here, officer," he said. "Is it your property?" Reynolds asked. "Yes, sir." "Did you ask this woman and her guests to leave?" "Yes, sir, around 10 in the morning. I asked her to pack up and go." "Did she refuse?" "Yes, sir. She said she was going to have the party regardless." Reynolds nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He looked back at Karen. "Ma'am, you entered this person's private property without permission, set up a party after being asked to leave, and now you're trying to file assault charges because he used his own sprinkler system." I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that makes you the one who's potentially liable here, not him. But the children, Karen started, as if the presence of teenagers somehow altered the legal and moral landscape. We're trespassing on someone else's property, Reynolds finished. With your permission, which is actually worse for you. He pulled out a small notepad. Do you want to press charges? I'm happy to take a statement, but I'll also need to explain to the prosecutor why you were on someone else's property after being explicitly told to leave. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her entire face was working through the rapid realization that she'd overplayed her hand, that she'd walked into a situation assuming the world would back her up, and instead found that it was actually her that needed backing. I'm suing, she said finally, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. That's between you and the civil courts, Reynolds said. Now I need both of you to keep the peace. Mr. Chen, if she comes back on your property, call us. Ms. Whitmore, I'd suggest you head home and dry off. He put his sunglasses back on, somehow completing the gesture in a way that felt final, definitive. The conversation was over. The case was closed. Karen Whitmore had attempted to bend the world to her will, and for the first time in what was probably a very long time, the world had resisted. She left about 20 minutes later after directing the caterers to pack everything up. The DJ crew had already left, unwilling to stay and deal with the aftermath. The string lights came down. The tables were folded. The entire setup was reversed in what felt like a fraction of the time it had taken to construct it. The teenage girls had mostly dispersed, though Marcus saw several of them filming on their phones as they left. By 3:45, the yard was empty except for Karen, who spent a final few minutes standing in the middle of the space, soaking wet, mascara running, surrounded by the debris of her failed afternoon, before she climbed into her Mercedes and drove away. Marcus stood on his patio, watching her go, and felt the strange sensation of something settling inside his chest. It was satisfaction, yes, but it was also something more complicated than that. It was the feeling of having finally pushed back against a force that had been pushing against him his entire life. It was vindication and relief, and also, underneath it all, a growing sense of dread. Because he knew this wasn't over. Karen Whitmore was not the kind of person who accepted defeat. She was the kind of person who saw setbacks as temporary obstacles, inconveniences to be worked around or destroyed. She would be plotting her response already, calculating how to turn this around, how to make him the villain in the story. He'd seen her type before. He'd worked with her type. He knew that she would see the officer's dismissal as just the beginning, not the end. His phone rang at 4:33 p.m. The caller ID said unknown number, but Marcus already knew who it was going to be. Mr. Chen, a woman's voice said when he answered. This is Patricia Brennan from Riverside Property Management. I'm calling regarding a claim that's been filed against you in relation to damage incurred at a private event on your property this afternoon. Marcus closed his eyes. Here we go, he thought. Who filed the claim? He asked, though he already knew the answer. A Karen Whitmore. She's alleging that your intentional activation of an irrigation system caused property damage to her clothing and personal items, as well as emotional distress. She's asking for compensation in the amount of $5,000, plus legal fees. I didn't cause her to trespass on my property, Marcus said carefully, aware that this call was probably being recorded, aware that everything he said was now part of a document trail. I asked her to leave. She refused. I activated my own sprinkler system on my own property. That's my right. Yes, well, that's a matter for the courts to determine, the woman said in a tone that suggested she couldn't care less about the actual details of the case. Ms. Whitmore is threatening to report this to the HOA as well, along with your homeowner's insurance company. She's also apparently started a social media campaign claiming that you deliberately attacked her and the teenagers in her care. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Social media. She's posted on the Riverside Neighborhood Facebook page, the community Discord, and her personal Instagram account. She's claiming you're a hostile, mentally unstable individual who targeted children. The taste of metal filled Marcus's mouth. This was worse than he'd anticipated. This was the thing about people like Karen. They understood that narrative was sometimes more powerful than fact. They understood that in the court of public opinion, the story that was told first often became the truth, regardless of the actual events. I can show you the video, Marcus said, and then he stopped himself. Should he be saying this? Should he be talking about the video without a lawyer present? I mean, a video. The property manager's voice changed slightly, became more interested. Of what? Of the event. I recorded it, Marcus said. She came into my yard without permission, refused to leave when asked, and set up a party without my consent. I activated the sprinklers to force them to leave. I have the entire thing recorded. Well, the woman said, and there was something almost like satisfaction in her voice now. That changes things considerably. Send me the video. I'll forward it to Ms. Whitmore's attorney. Marcus hung up the phone and realized that his hands were shaking. He opened Instagram and found Corinne's account without difficulty. She'd posted a carousel of photos, her looking stunned, her soaking wet, her pointing at his house with what she'd probably captioned as the scene of the crime. The captions were everything he'd feared. Can you believe someone would deliberately attack children? I will not let this be swept under the rug. My lawyer is already involved. Justice for our kids' hostile suburban mental health crisis. The posts already had hundreds of comments, most of them supportive. People were coming out of the woodwork to express outrage at his behavior, to offer sympathy to Corinne, to share their own stories about difficult neighbors and intrusive homeowners. The narrative was already forming, the story was already being written, and he was the villain in all of it. Marcus sat on his couch and tried to think. He needed to call a lawyer. He needed to contact his homeowner's insurance company. He needed to do a lot of things, but first, he needed to understand what had just happened. How a situation he'd controlled completely at 2:29 p.m. had completely spiraled out of control by 4:33 p.m. The answer came in a text message at 5:12 p.m. from a number he didn't recognize. Hey Marcus, it's Tom from the neighborhood Facebook group. I saw what Corinne posted about what happened at your house. Just wanted you to know that a bunch of us saw the party set up this morning. We thought it was weird. Corinne's been telling everyone on the HOA board that she rented your yard. That's not true, right? Marcus stared at the message. Tom. He tried to remember who Tom was. He came up with a vague image of a man with a beard who lived 3 streets over, someone he'd waved at maybe twice. He typed back, "It's not true. She showed up without permission." The response was almost instantaneous. That's what we thought. Also, did you really activate the sprinklers intentionally? Because honestly, that's kind of hilarious. Corinne's been a nightmare on the HOA board, but some people here are taking her side, so you might want to get ahead of this. By the time night fell, Marcus had received similar messages from 4 other neighbors, people he'd never really talked to, people who suddenly felt empowered to contact him because they sensed a conflict and wanted to pick a side. Most were sympathetic, some were not. One person, a woman named Susan, wrote, "I have 2 teenage daughters. What you did was reckless and dangerous. Those kids could have been hurt." Marcus deleted that message without responding. He tried to eat dinner but couldn't. He tried to watch television but couldn't focus. He kept refreshing Corinne's social media, watching the post accumulate likes and comments, watching the narrative solidify in real time. She'd moved to the next phase, no longer talking about the party or her refusal to leave, but focusing entirely on the attack, on the recklessness, on the danger she and the children had faced. One of the teenage girls had actually posted her own video. She was in her room, wearing dry clothes, looking serious. Her caption read, "I can't believe what happened to us today. This man deliberately soaked us with sprinklers as some kind of punishment. My mom is handling the legal stuff, but I just wanted to share my experience so people know what kind of person he is." The video had been viewed 8,000 times. At 11:47 p.m., Marcus's phone rang. It was his lawyer, David Marsh, a man he'd hired during the divorce 3 years ago and had kept on retainer just in case. David was in his 60s, had been handling suburban disputes and minor civil cases for 30 years, and had the kind of controlled calm that came from seeing thousands of variations of human conflict play out in almost exactly the same ways. "I heard about your situation," David said without preamble. "Corinne's attorney contacted my office with the claim. More importantly, I've been monitoring the social media posts. We need to talk about your response strategy." "I just want this to go away," Marcus said, and he was surprised by how small his voice sounded. "That's not going to happen," David said gently. "But we can control how it plays out. First, you're going to send me that video. Second, you're not going to respond to anything on social media, nothing, no matter how tempting. Third, you're going to let me do the talking. Can you do those things?" "I can try," Marcus said. "Good, because here's the thing about people like Corinne. They're counting on you being overwhelmed and panicking and making mistakes. They're counting on you fighting back publicly, saying things you'll regret, giving them more ammunition. We're not going to give them that. We're going to be quiet, professional, and devastating when the time comes. Marcus felt something shift slightly, a very small reduction in the pressure crushing his chest. What does that mean? It means, David said, that we wait. We let her push her narrative. We document everything. And then when her attorney comes to us with actual legal claims, we bury them with the truth. You have a video, you have a recording of her refusing to leave, you have a police officer's statement. Do you understand how powerful those things are? I think so, Marcus said. Good, now get some sleep. This is going to get worse before it gets better, but I promise you, the ending is not the one Karen Whitmore is expecting. Marcus hung up and tried to sleep, but he found himself returning to the kitchen window repeatedly throughout the night, looking out at his yard, his sanctuary, his refuge, his place, and wondering when it would stop feeling like a danger zone. There was an article in the community newsletter, not a major publication, but something that went out to all 2,000 residents of the Riverside neighborhood. It was framed as a safety concern about community tensions and made vague references to disagreements over property usage and emotional incidents that have left multiple families distressed. Karen's name wasn't mentioned, but the details made it obvious. And worse, neither was Marcus's. He was a phantom villain, a some neighbor who had done something to some children. All the specifics carefully elided to create maximum ambiguity and plausible deniability. By Monday morning, the HOA had sent him an official letter requesting a meeting to discuss a community complaint regarding your property and recent events. The letter was signed by Gerald Patterson, the HOA board president, a man Marcus had seen exactly once in the 3 years he'd lived there. David advised him to attend. Show respect, David said over the phone. Answer their questions directly. Don't volunteer information, but don't hide anything either. They're probably on Karen's side, but there are usually a few reasonable people on these boards. Let's see what we're working with. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening at the HOA office, a small building on the edge of the neighborhood that looked like a slightly nicer version of a typical suburban storage facility. Marcus arrived at 6:47 p.m., 5 minutes early, wearing business casual clothes and the expression of a man who had nothing to hide. The HOA board consisted of 5 people. There was Gerald Patterson in his 60s, with the kind of face that suggested he'd made a career out of saying no to other people's ideas. There was Margaret Liu, probably early 70s, with kind eyes and the expression of someone who'd been watching community drama for so long that it barely registered anymore. There was a younger man in his 30s named David something, Marcus didn't catch his last name, who looked like he'd been voluntold to join the board by his wife. And there were 2 women in their 50s who seemed to be friends and had positioned their chairs close together. Marcus had not been expecting her to be on the board. He'd assumed she would be presenting her case, not sitting in judgment. But there she was, in the back corner of the room, no longer soaking wet but still emanating a kind of palpable fury. Gerald Patterson opened the meeting with the kind of careful formality that suggested he'd been coaching himself to be fair-minded. Thank you all for being here. We've received a community complaint regarding an incident at Mr. Chen's property this past Saturday. I'll let Karen describe the situation in her own words. Karen stood, and Marcus had to admire her composure. Whatever rage she was feeling was compressed into a neat package of concerned mother energy. Thank you, she said, and her voice was perfectly modulated. Not angry, not hysterical, just disappointed. I want to be clear about something first. I'm not here to get revenge or to push this further than necessary. I'm here because I believe our community needs to understand the kind of danger that can exist in our own neighborhoods. It was a brilliant opening move. She was immediately reframing this from I trespassed and he retaliated to I'm concerned about my community. On Saturday, she continued, I hosted a modest swimming event in the afternoon. I had attempted to make arrangements with Mr. Chen's residents, but the communication was unclear. Given that several girls were already scheduled to arrive, I proceeded with the event, planning to clarify the details with Mr. Chen in person. When he arrived, he was understandably upset about the situation. Lies, all of it lies. And yet, the way she was telling it, the gracious acceptance of his potential upset, the reasonable explanation for her actions, made it sound almost plausible. I attempted to apologize and suggested a compromise. I would pay him a rental fee and have everything cleaned up by evening. He, however, became increasingly hostile. He told me to leave in very rude terms. At that point, I had 17 teenage girls already in and around the pool. I couldn't possibly abandon them. So I explained that we would pack up shortly and asked him to please remain patient. This was not what had happened. What had happened was she dismissed him, waved away his concerns, told him to stay inside his own house. What followed, Karen said, and her voice dropped to a stage whisper, was deliberate and intentional. He activated his sprinkler system at maximum capacity while 17 teenage girls, children, were in his pool and yard. We had no warning. It was traumatic. One girl hit her head on the pool edge trying to get away from the water. Several reported anxiety symptoms afterward. That last detail was new, Marcus noted. He wondered if it was even true or if it was something Karen had improvised in the moment. I'm not here to sue, Karen concluded, though my attorney advises that I could. I'm here because I believe this person poses a genuine risk to our community. His behavior was unstable, impulsive, and dangerous, and I believe the HOA has a responsibility to address it. She sat down. The silence in the room was heavy. Gerald Patterson looked at Marcus. Mr. Chen, would you like to respond? Yes, Marcus said. He'd prepared for this moment, had written out his statement and practiced it with David. He kept his voice calm. I need to clarify the facts of what happened. Ms. Whitmore arrived at my property at approximately 9:47 a.m. without my knowledge or permission. She began setting up for an event using my pool. When I asked her to leave, she refused, stating that she was going to have the party regardless. I asked her multiple times, and she ignored me. I gave her a clear warning that if she didn't leave, I would activate the sprinkler system. She chose not to leave. This was a lie. The warning had been implied rather than explicit. But it was also true in spirit. He had clearly asked her to leave, and she had clearly refused. The warning was implicit in the request. When she refused my requests, Marcus continued, I activated the system as a way to make the situation untenable for her to continue. I did this on my own property, to remove trespassers from my own property after they had explicitly been told to leave. No one told me anything about a warning, Karen said sharply, breaking protocol and speaking out of turn. You never said. Ms. Whitmore, Gerald Patterson said with the tone of someone enforcing rules he'd written. You'll have a chance to respond, but please allow Mr. Chen to finish. Marcus continued, his voice steady. I have video documentation of Ms. Whitmore being told to leave at approximately 10 a.m. I also have the recording of the sprinkler activation, which shows that while it was, yes, powerful water pressure, it was not dangerous. No one was in the pool when the sprinklers were activated. Everyone left the pool area immediately upon the first spray of water. No one was injured. The video shows everyone was safe. David had advised him not to mention the video yet, but Marcus had decided to reveal its existence now. He wanted to see how they reacted, wanted to gauge whether the board would actually look at evidence or whether they'd already made their minds up. Margaret Liu leaned forward. You have video of the entire incident. Yes, Marcus said, starting from approximately 9:45 a.m. through the end of the sprinkler activation. I'd like to see that, Margaret said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was actually interested in facts rather than narratives. My attorney can provide copies, Marcus said, glancing at David, who nodded. I don't think we need to see a video, Karen said quickly. The facts speak for themselves. Multiple witnesses were there. We can attest to what happened. The facts would speak for themselves more clearly if we actually examined the evidence, the younger man, David something, said. He seemed to be picking up on something in the room's energy. I think we should see the video before we make any decisions. What followed was a brief, tense conversation about process and procedure. In the end, they agreed to adjourn and reconvene the following week, after all relevant materials, including Marcus's video, had been reviewed by board members. As Marcus was leaving, Karen caught him by the arm in the parking lot. Her grip was tight, her nails pressing small crescents into his skin. You think you're clever, she hissed, but you're not. That video doesn't show anything. It just shows me trying to host a party and you being deliberately antagonistic. My attorney has already reviewed it and he says I have a strong case. Marcus pulled his arm away. Your attorney is probably trying to get your money. My attorney, Karen said, her voice dropping to something that sounded almost like a growl, is one of the best in the state. He's already moving forward with a civil suit and a formal complaint with the police department. You're going to regret this. I'm going to make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of person you are. I'm the kind of person who asked you to leave my property, Marcus said quietly, and you refused. Everything else is consequences. He drove home and found that someone had left a flyer on his doorstep. It was a printout of Corinne's Instagram post, with her claims about the attack clearly outlined. Below it, someone had handwritten in red marker, "Are your kids safe with this person living here?" Marcus threw it away, but he took a photograph first, sending it to David. David's response came within an hour. "This is good. This is harassment. Keep documenting everything. Every piece of evidence she provides actually helps our case by showing a pattern of escalation on her end." But Marcus wasn't sure David was right, because what was happening now wasn't legal anymore. It was social. It was the court of public opinion, and the rules there were different. The rules there were that the person who told the most compelling story won, and Corinne was very good at telling stories. By Thursday, he'd found 3 more flyers on his doorstep. By Friday, there was a petition started on the neighborhood social media pages. Safety concerns regarding 425 Riverside Drive that had already collected 42 signatures. The comments were worse than the petition itself. "I have kids. This kind of behavior is unacceptable. Unstable individuals like this are why neighborhoods fall apart. This is exactly why we need stronger HOA enforcement." And then finally, the thing that broke him. His ex-wife called. Sarah had moved to Colorado after the divorce and had largely stayed out of his life. They'd been cordial but distant. They didn't have kids, which made it relatively easy to maintain separation. "Marcus," she said without preamble, "what the hell is going on? I just got contacted by someone claiming to be a reporter for the neighborhood newsletter. They're asking about your history of unstable behavior and whether I have any concerns about your mental health." "Who is this woman?" "Someone I activated a sprinkler system on," Marcus said flatly. "I'm sorry, what?" He explained the situation, the whole thing from beginning to end. By the time he was done, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus," she said finally, "you know how this plays out. You know what people are like. This woman is not going to stop. She's going to keep pushing until you either move away or do something you regret." "I know," Marcus said. "So why did you do it? Why did you activate the sprinklers? You could have just called the police when she showed up. You could have handled it in dozens of ways that didn't involve turning yourself into the villain of your own story." That was the question, wasn't it? Why had he done it? He'd had time to think about it, days to analyze his own motivations, and he still wasn't entirely sure. The second HOA meeting took place on a Wednesday evening, exactly 1 week after the first. Marcus had spent that entire week in a state of suspended animation, going to work, coming home, refreshing his email constantly. David had sent him a message 3 days before the meeting. "We're ready. The video is devastating for her case." Marcus wasn't sure if that was true, or if David was just trying to keep his morale up. The meeting room was more crowded this time. There were at least 30 people present, neighbors who'd become invested in the situation, people who wanted to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. Corinne was there, sitting in the front row with a man in an expensive suit who Marcus assumed was her attorney. There was also, inexplicably, a woman with a camera, which suggested that Corinne had contacted the local news. Gerald Patterson looked uncomfortable, the expression of a man who'd hoped his volunteer position as HOA president would involve boring conversations about landscaping standards. Instead, he was presiding over what had become a genuine neighborhood controversy. "Before we begin," Gerald said, "I want to make it clear that this meeting is being held to review evidence pertinent to the complaint filed against Mr. Chen. This is not a trial, and we are not determining guilt or innocence. We are simply attempting to understand the facts of what occurred on March 15th. He gestured to a television that had been set up in the corner of the room. "Mr. Chen's attorney has provided video documentation of the events in question. We're going to watch it now, in its entirety. After the viewing, we'll hear from both parties." David had edited the video carefully. It started at 9:43 a.m., showing Corinne's catering truck pulling up. It showed her approaching Marcus's back patio with the clipboard. It captured in crystal clarity the moment she told him she was going to have the party regardless of his permission. It showed Marcus asking her to leave, his voice calm and clear. "You can't have my yard. You didn't ask me. You didn't get my permission. You showed up with caterers and construction equipment and told me to hide in my house. The answer is no. Take everything down and get out." And it showed Corinne's response. "I own a piece of this street, and I have every right to use the common areas." The entire incident, condensed down to 6 minutes of footage, was damning for Corinne. She wasn't some concerned mother trying to host a modest family event. She was someone who had arrived with an entire production, had been explicitly told to leave, and had refused. She had, in fact, been the aggressor in every single exchange. When the video reached the moment of the sprinkler activation, the room went absolutely silent. The water erupted, and even on the small television screen, it was clear that while the pressure was powerful, it was not actually dangerous. The teenagers screamed, but there was laughter mixed with the screaming. Corinne was furious, yes, but she was also dry. She'd been standing away from the main spray, protected by the edge of the pergola. The video ended with the sprinklers shutting off and Marcus's face in the garage window, expressionless and composed. When the lights came back up, the room felt completely different. Margaret Liu was nodding slowly. The younger man, David something, had his arms crossed over his chest, his expression thoughtful. The two women who'd been Corinne's apparent supporters earlier were staring straight ahead, not making eye contact with anyone. Gerald Patterson looked directly at Corinne. "Ms. Whitmore, I have to say, this is significantly different from the description you provided in our previous meeting." Corinne's attorney stood up immediately. "I object to the framing of this. The video clearly shows." "You object," Gerald said mildly. "This isn't a courtroom, counselor. It's a community board meeting. And what the video clearly shows is that Ms. Whitmore was explicitly told to leave Mr. Chen's property, and she refused to do so. It also shows that Mr. Chen's activation of the sprinkler system caused no actual harm to anyone." "The emotional distress," Corinne started, "was caused by your own refusal to respect someone's property boundaries," Margaret Liu interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, Corinne, but I don't see how the HOA can reasonably support your complaint in light of this evidence. Mr. Chen asked you to leave. You refused. He took action to make you leave. That's not a violation of HOA rules." "This is ridiculous," Corinne's attorney said. "My client was attempting to host a party and was violently attacked." "No one was attacked," David something said flatly. "No one was injured. There was no violence. There was water on a property that the person who owns it is entitled to manage as he sees fit." What followed was a brief, one-sided conversation in which the HOA board essentially explained to Corinne that they were dismissing her complaint. It was polite. It was professional. But it was absolutely clear that she had lost. Corinne left the meeting without speaking to anyone. Her attorney gathered his papers and followed her out. The woman with the camera looked disappointed. Apparently, she'd been hopping for more drama. After the room had mostly cleared, Margaret Liu approached Marcus and shook his hand. "That was well handled," she said. "Not many people would have the wherewithal to get the entire thing on video. I suspect Ms. Whitmore is not used to being held accountable." "Thank you," Marcus said, and he meant it. Outside in the parking lot, David pulled him aside. "That went better than expected. Corinne's attorney is going to advise her to drop the civil suit. The evidence is just too clear that she was the aggressor." "What about the social media stuff?" Marcus asked. "The flyers, the petition." "Leave that to me," David said. "I'm sending her attorney a cease and desist letter tonight. If she continues the harassment campaign, we'll have documented evidence of defamation. She's in a much weaker position now than she was before." But Marcus knew that cease and desist letters were difficult things to enforce. They were pieces of paper, basically. Corinne could ignore it. Corinne could continue her campaign. Corinne could. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Congrats on your little victory. Don't get too comfortable. This is far from over." There was no signature, but Marcus knew who it was from. He showed the message to David, who photographed it immediately. "Perfect," David said. "Direct harassment. Keep your phone on you. Try to get her to communicate with you in writing as much as possible. Every message she sends is another nail in her coffin." That night, Marcus sat in his house and tried to process what had happened. He'd won. The HOA had sided with him. The evidence had been overwhelming and indisputable. By any reasonable metric, justice had been served. And yet he felt hollow. He thought about the moment he'd pressed the button on the sprinkler timer. He thought about the sense of control and righteousness he'd felt in that moment. He thought about how good it had felt to finally push back against someone who had pushed against him. But he also thought about how that moment had cost him. 2 weeks of his life consumed by stress and anxiety. His ex-wife being dragged into things. His neighborhood divided. His sanctuary, his beautiful $40,000 sanctuary, now permanently tainted by association with chaos and conflict. He opened his laptop and started searching for houses on the market. It took him less than an hour to find something interesting. A house on the other side of town, slightly smaller, slightly cheaper, but with good bones and a smaller, more manageable yard. He sent the listing to David. "I'm thinking about moving," he wrote in the email. David's response came back almost immediately. "Don't, you won. If you leave now, it looks like she drove you out. She'll see it as victory. Don't give her that." Marcus stared at the message for a long time. David was probably right from a purely strategic standpoint, but strategy and well-being were different things. He left the email unanswered and spent the rest of the night researching houses in different neighborhoods, in different towns, in different parts of the state. Anywhere that wasn't here. Anywhere that didn't contain the memory of Corinne Whitmore and her certainty that the world belonged to her. By the next morning, he'd made a decision. He was going to stay, not because David was right about the strategy, not because he wanted to prove something to Corinne, but because he was tired of running, tired of letting other people, first his ex-wife, then his therapist, now Corinne, now David, dictate what his life should look like. He was going to stay, and he was going to stop letting himself be defined by his conflicts. The video of the sprinkler incident had spread beyond the neighborhood. It had made it to Reddit, where it had been viewed by over 1 million people. The comments were mixed, but a significant portion were supportive. People liked the narrative of someone finally pushing back against an unreasonable authority figure. People liked the satisfaction of seeing consequence delivered in real time. People liked Marcus. There was also a subreddit called r/HOA horrors, where the video was the top post for 3 consecutive days. Corinne, meanwhile, had gone quiet. The social media posts stopped. The petitions were removed. The flyers disappeared. It was as if, once she'd lost the HOA battle, something inside her had shut down. The narrative had been taken from her, and without the ability to control the story, she seemed to have lost interest in the entire situation. By the following week, Marcus had almost returned to normal. He went to work. He came home. He sat by his pool, which still felt like it belonged to him, which had been reclaimed from the chaos and restored to being simply his. Marcus was in his study, reviewing quarterly reports for work when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment he considered not answering, but then he recognized the silhouette through the door's frosted glass. He opened the door to find Corinne standing on his porch, alone, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse. She looked different without her armor of designer clothes and superiority. She looked smaller, somehow, and tired in a way that suggested she hadn't been sleeping. "I don't think you should be here," Marcus said, his hand remaining on the door frame, creating a barrier between them. "I know," Corinne said. Her voice was quiet, almost hoarse. "Your attorney's letter made it clear that I'm not welcome, but I needed to talk to you, not as adversaries, just as neighbors." "We're not neighbors," Marcus said. "Neighbors respect each other's boundaries." "I know that now," Corinne said, and something in the way she said it made Marcus pause. There was no anger in her voice, no superiority, no underlying rage, just exhaustion and something that might have been genuine contrition. "Can I come inside just for 5 minutes? I promise that's all I need." Every instinct Marcus had was screaming at him not to allow this. David would absolutely advise against it. But there was something in Corinne's face that suggested she wasn't here for a fight. She was here for something else entirely. He stepped back and let her in. They sat in his living room, separated by enough space that neither of them felt threatened. Corinne looked around at his house, at the simple, carefully chosen furniture, at the art on the walls, at the way he decorated the space to reflect who he actually was rather than who he thought he should be. "This is nice," she said finally. "It's very peaceful." Marcus didn't respond. He was waiting for whatever this actually was. "I came here to apologize," Corinne said. "And I know that probably doesn't mean much given everything, but I wanted to say it anyway. I was wrong." I was arrogant and entitled and disrespectful of your property and your boundaries. I did all of those things that I claimed you did. I was the aggressor. I was the one who refused to listen. I was the one who violated your space and your trust. Marcus waited. There was usually a but coming in situations like this. There usually was. After the HOA meeting, Karen continued, I couldn't avoid the reality of what I'd done anymore. I was forced to actually watch myself in that video to see how I'd treated you, to see how dismissive I'd been of your very reasonable requests. And I was ashamed. Why are you telling me this? Marcus asked. Because, Karen said, and her voice cracked slightly, my daughter saw the video, the one with me in the pool, the one that circulated on social media. And she asked me why I was being so mean to a neighbor, why I wouldn't just leave when he asked me to. And I couldn't answer her. And she's been distant with me since then. She doesn't respect me anymore. She doesn't understand why I acted that way. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. This was the thing he hadn't anticipated, that Karen's actions would have consequences for people other than herself and him. That her daughter would see her mother's behavior and judge her for it. That there would be actual, real cost beyond property damage or HOA meetings. I deserved that, Karen said. I deserve to be held accountable. I wanted you to know that you were right to do what you did. I needed to be taught a lesson about boundaries and consequences. I needed to be shown that the world doesn't just roll over because I want it to. She stood up. I'm going to drop the lawsuit completely. I'm going to tell my attorney to withdraw everything. I'm also going to make a post on social media clarifying what actually happened, that I trespassed, that you asked me to leave, that your response was proportional and justified. I'm going to take responsibility publicly. You don't have to do that, Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. I do, Karen said. Not for you, for my daughter, for myself, because I need to actually become the kind of person my daughter can respect. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. The house I'm building, the teardown I created by demolishing the old craftsman cottage, I regret that. I've been thinking about that project for a while, and I realize now that I destroyed something that mattered to other people just because I wanted something different. I can't undo that, but I'm thinking about how I can make better choices going forward. And then she was gone, walking back to her car, back to her life, back to whatever process of reckoning she was undertaking. Marcus stood in his living room, processing what had just happened. He didn't know if he believed her. He didn't know if this was genuine contrition or a strategic move to manipulate him into dropping his guard. He didn't know if anything she'd said was actually true or if it was just another iteration of the narrative that Karen Whitmore was so good at crafting. He called David and reported the conversation. Well, David said, if she actually follows through on the post and the withdrawal of the suit, that's good news for us. It's also the kind of move that's hard to fake. You can't fake dropping a multi-thousand-dollar lawsuit, so I'd say there's a decent chance she was being genuine. Or, Marcus said, she's trying to manipulate me into lowering my guard so she can make some other move. Possible, David conceded. But I don't think so. What would be the point? She's already lost. The HOA backed you. The video is public. She's got nothing left to gain by continuing the battle. Marcus spent that evening waiting for Karen's social media post. It came at 9:47 p.m., exactly 1 week after the first appearance of her catering truck in his yard. It was a long, detailed explanation of what had actually happened, written with the precision of someone who'd learned to be accurate when faced with indisputable evidence. I was wrong, the post concluded. Not just about this specific situation, but about how I approach my life and my relationship with the people around me. My neighbor did nothing wrong. He asked me to leave his property, and when I refused, he took reasonable steps to enforce his boundaries. I deserved the consequence, and I've learned from it. The comments that followed were interesting. Some people were sympathetic, expressing support for her growth and change. Others were skeptical, assuming it was a tactical move. A few were harsh, nodding that her contrition came too late after she'd already caused significant disruption and conflict. But what struck Marcus most was that the narrative had shifted. It was no longer about him being the villain. The story was now about Karen learning a lesson, and while that wasn't entirely comfortable either, he didn't relish being the instrument of someone else's moral education. It was better. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in his backyard, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The pool gleamed in the golden light, no longer tainted by the memory of chaos. The pergola was draped in jasmine vines that smelled of late summer and possibility. He'd made the decision to stay. He'd also made the decision to forgive, not necessarily Karen, but the situation itself and his own role in it. Because while he was right to defend his boundaries, he'd also learned something about himself through this experience. He'd learned that he had a capacity for anger that he'd been suppressing his entire life. He'd learned that there were times when pushing back felt justified, when the answer to someone else's entitlement could be a cold, calculated response delivered with ice in your veins. And he'd learned that those moments, while sometimes necessary, came with their own cost. The doorbell rang at 6:47 p.m. as if on schedule. Marcus turned off the pool lights and went inside. It was his ex-wife, Sarah. She was standing on his porch looking hesitant, holding a bottle of expensive wine in one hand. "Hi," she said. "I wanted to apologize for judging you about the sprinkler thing, for acting like you'd done something wrong. I watched the video and I saw what actually happened and I realized I'd been unfair. You'd asked her to leave. She refused. You did what you had to do." Marcus felt something warm in his chest. It was nice to be vindicated, even after the fact. Even after the HOA meeting and Karen's contrition and the resolution of the conflict. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "Come in, let's open that wine." They sat on his patio, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. Sarah told him about her life in Colorado, the job she loved, the relationships that hadn't worked out, the way she'd thought about him sometimes and wondered if he was doing okay. "I was worried about you," she said. "When this whole thing started, I was terrified that you'd implode, that you'd let Karen push you around and swallow your anger the way you always do. But then you didn't. You actually pushed back. And while it looked chaotic and dramatic from the outside, I think it was good for you." "I'm not sure I'd recommend the method," Marcus said, "but yeah, it was clarifying." "You know what you should do?" Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she'd been thinking about this for a while. "You should tell this story to other people, because there's something there about boundaries and entitlement and the cost of letting people walk all over you. There's something real about what you experienced." "Who would I tell?" Marcus asked. "Anyone, everyone. The internet, maybe. People who relate to feeling like they can't say no, who are afraid of confrontation, who let other people's needs override their own. I think they'd find something valuable in what happened to you." Marcus considered this. The idea of turning his personal chaos into some kind of larger narrative, of transforming his humiliation and vindication into content that other people might consume or learn from, it had a certain appeal. But it also felt invasive, like he'd be exposing something raw and still healing. "Maybe eventually," he said. "Right now, I just want to enjoy the peace and quiet." Sarah laughed. "Fair enough, but hold on to that idea. I think it matters." She left around midnight, driving back to her hotel with promises to visit more often, with the sense that something had shifted between them. Not toward romance, but toward genuine friendship, toward the possibility of being people who could exist in each other's lives without the weight of their failed marriage dragging everything down. Marcus went to bed that night feeling more at peace than he had in weeks. The next morning, he woke to find that Karen Whitmore had moved. The news came from Tom, his neighbor 3 streets over, the one who'd first messaged him with support. Tom had seen a "sold" sign go up on Karen's property overnight. "Apparently, she's moving to the coast," Tom said over coffee that Marcus invited him to have on the patio. "I heard from someone who works in real estate that she sold her house for below market value. She wanted out fast." Marcus wasn't sure how he felt about this information. Part of him felt satisfied. Karen had been so thoroughly defeated by the situation that she'd chosen to leave the neighborhood entirely. But another part of him felt something more complicated. Pity, maybe, or understanding. Karen had learned a hard lesson about boundaries and entitlement, and instead of staying to live with that lesson, she'd chosen to escape. She'd chosen to start over somewhere else, probably making the same mistakes in a different context, probably not having actually learned anything except that she couldn't win every battle. "Good riddance," Tom said, raising his coffee mug in a mock toast. But Marcus found himself thinking about Karen as she drove away from the neighborhood, alone in her car, heading towards some new beginning that probably wouldn't be all that different from her old life. He thought about her daughter, about whether she'd actually repair that relationship or whether the damage was permanent. He thought about the craftsman cottage that Karen had destroyed to build her McMansion. That seemed like the greater tragedy, somehow, the loss of history and character in the pursuit of something new and impressive. He called David that afternoon. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Nothing," David said. "It's over. The threat is gone. The harassment will presumably stop now that she's moved away. You can go back to your life." "Just like that?" "Just like that," David confirmed. "Unless you want to pursue counterclaims against her for the defamation and harassment, but I'd advise against it. You won. Let her go." So Marcus let her go. He let the conflict go. He let the anger go, or at least, he began the process of letting it go, a process that he recognized would take time and intention and probably professional help. Life returned to something approaching normal. He went to work. He came home. He sat by his pool in the evenings and tried to reclaim the feeling of sanctuary that had defined his relationship with this space before Karen Whitmore had disrupted it. He was largely successful, though there were moments, especially in the afternoons around 1 or 2 p.m., when he found himself expecting her to reappear, when he was almost waiting for the next violation, the next boundary pushing, the next refusal to accept the word no. But she didn't come back. And eventually, months later, Marcus stopped checking social media to see if she'd posted anything else, stopped wondering about her new life by the coast, stopped defining himself through his conflict with her. He just lived. It was on a Tuesday evening, almost exactly a year after the original incident, that something unexpected happened. The neighborhood newsletter, the same one that had published the vague references to his hostile behavior, ran a feature. It was called Lessons in Community, and it was written by the HOA board. The article detailed Karen Whitmore's trespass and subsequent departure from the community. It framed her leaving as a positive thing, as the neighborhood protecting itself from someone who didn't respect boundaries. But then, in the final paragraph, something surprising. "However, we want to acknowledge that our neighbor, Mr. Marcus Chen, handled a difficult situation with grace and restraint. While his activation of the sprinkler system was dramatic, it was ultimately justified by Ms. Whitmore's refusal to respect his property boundaries. This situation should serve as a reminder to all residents that community living requires respect for each other's spaces and reasonable boundaries. Those of us who have lived here long are grateful for Mr. Chen's willingness to hold the line on what matters." It was a vindication, public and unambiguous. Margaret Liu had apparently written it based on the tone. It felt like closure. That evening, Marcus received an email from a literary agent in New York. She'd apparently found his name mentioned in various Reddit threads about the incident, had looked up more information about him, and had come across a blog post he'd written months earlier, processing the experience through the lens of therapy and recovery. "I think your story matters," the agent wrote. "I think it's a story about power dynamics and entitlement, about boundaries and the cost of defending them. I think there's a book in here. Would you be interested in talking about that?" Marcus stared at the email for a long time. He thought about Sarah's suggestion, about the idea of transforming his experience into narrative, into something that other people might learn from or relate to. The book was titled Sprinklers: How I Learned to Say No, and it was published by a moderately prestigious publishing house that specialized in memoir and personal growth narratives. It sold modestly but consistently, the kind of book that found its audience through word of mouth and social media recommendations, that spawned the occasional article about suburban conflicts and boundary setting. Marcus did a few readings, gave a couple of interviews, and found that talking about his experience in a structured context felt genuinely healing. He wasn't selling his trauma. He was using his experience as a lens through which to examine larger questions about power and entitlement, and the cost of finally, after years of suppression, pushing back against someone who was trying to take what wasn't theirs. He learned, through the process of writing the book, that Karen Whitmore had indeed made changes in her life. She was living by the coast, running a nonprofit focused on conflict resolution and meditative practices for women over 50. Marcus found this information somewhat amusing, that Karen had taken the lesson of the sprinklers and transformed it into a career helping others learn boundaries and emotional regulation. He hoped she was genuinely helping people. He hoped she'd actually changed. But he also understood that people were complicated, that everyone was the hero of their own story, that the version of events that Karen told herself about her life at the coast was probably very different from the version that existed in objective reality. He'd made peace with that ambiguity. His backyard had fully reclaimed its status as sanctuary. The pool gleamed in the afternoon light. The pergola was covered in jasmine vines that smelled like memory and possibility. He spent his evenings there, sometimes reading, sometimes writing, sometimes just sitting and watching the light change as the seasons turned. And in the spring of the following year, when the neighborhood held its first annual Community Respect Day, organized around the concept of honoring property boundaries and treating each other with kindness, Marcus attended and felt something almost like forgiveness, not of Corinne Whitmore exactly, but of himself, of his anger, of the moment when he'd pressed the button on the sprinkler timer. The justice he'd delivered that afternoon had been cold and calculated, but it had also been necessary. It had finally taught him that he had the right to protect what was his, to say no, to enforce his boundaries even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant disruption and conflict and social consequences. And while he wouldn't necessarily recommend his method to others, he also wouldn't change what he'd done. Because sometimes, he'd learned, people need to be soaked with water before they understand that not everything in the world belongs to them.